Okay, so what is Prism Analytics? Prism Analytics basically allows the data administrators, data analysts, or reporting or related data consultants, right, to
Yes.
basically analyze Workday as well as non-Workday data together. So with Workday's reporting and analytic capabilities, which were always there, right? We any which ways already had the ability to understand any data or visualize or analyze any data which was already there in Workday. Now the problem is, how do I bring this data together with the non-Workday data which could be relevant for my analytics, right? And Prism Analytics as a solution allows me to do that. So Workday Prism Analytics, if I have to quickly define that, with So with Workday Prism Analytics, the idea is your data admins, data analysts, administrators, consultants, they can basically analyze both Workday and non-Workday data together. So which means I can bring data from different sources, right? Now, many times, how do you bring data from different sources? You do that with the help of integrations, right? You have to build integrations, and for building any integration, so let's if I build an EIB or connector or studio, it's a very complex task, in the sense I have to understand the structure and the format and the technology of that third party system, right? So how I extract data from SAP could be completely different or from how I extract data from Chronos, based on what APIs are exposed and what data is exposed by those APIs. Now, Prism, it completely simplifies this transaction. So, unlike connectors, for example, wherein we have 200 plus connectors and a lot of generic connectors, lot of specific third party named connectors. So we have specific connectors which are available to connect Workday with SAP. There are specific connectors for different benefit vendors, let's say Aetna and Emery Health and so on and so forth. So there are specific named connectors available which allow us to link Workday with those specific named third party systems. Similarly, we have generic connectors as well. We have, for example, core connector worker. So there is this huge inventory of named connectors as well as these generic connectors, which are used for connecting and getting data or sending data from Workday to those third-party systems. But then that list is not enough, and that's when we build our studio integrations. Now, Prism Analytics, it completely removes the need for building different uh, different integrations for different third-party systems. So it makes use of a standard and very simple interface for getting that data. And you do that with the help of either files or with the help of SFTP server. And we'll talk about those aspects in detail later. So the idea is, because you can bring data from multiple sources and analyze it together, your data analysis is much faster. It is easier to perform. It is secure, and we'll talk about security in detail. So the data in Workday Prism Analytics, it adheres to the Workday's configurable security framework. So you can define, similar to how when you build your reports, we apply the domain security or the data set security. Now the same security can also be applied to data which is coming from different sources, even if that is a non-Workday source. So your analysis becomes faster, it becomes easier, it becomes more secured. Okay, so the Prism workflow, it's very simple. If I have to define the high level workflow, it is simple, three steps. One is to get data, right? And this could be from Workday or external. So the first step of any Prism workflow is to get data. So the first one is get data. The second one is prepare data. Your data is coming from different sources. You are getting raw data. It has to be prepared for final analysis. And how do we prepare it? By basically blending this data coming from different sources, transforming it, applying Prism calculations, applying security permissions, performing unions, joins, and all the different types of data transformation steps. So with preparation, we talk about cleansing and transforming data, right? We talk about blending data in different data sets. I will talk about what is a data set as we go through this course. Then we talk about applying the security permissions, which will basically allow you to control who has access to which data or which part of the data that you are preparing through your Prism Analytics. And finally, we publish this data. And we'll talk about publishing this data again in detail. And then once this data is prepared, it is ready for analysis. And how do you do your analysis? Through Workday's reporting and discovery board capabilities. So these are the three simple steps for which is part of any Prism workflow. Okay, now we'll
Yep.
talk about these steps in detail as we go through the Prism data management workflow. Okay, before I go there, what are the Prism setup steps? So Prism setup. So when we talk about data sources are only used for the purpose of reporting. So when you build your reports, obviously you select the relevant data sources on the relevant business objects. And that's what you do for building your reports, right? But when we talk about any functionality, you're not talking in terms of data sources and business objects. They would get automatically activated, provided you activate the functionality first, right? And this is true whether you talk about payroll or compensation or Prism or any other module, submodule in Workday. Okay, the first thing, your tenant should be enabled for Prism Analytics. So the first thing obviously is you allow Workday to enable Prism Analytics on your tenant, right? And when would Workday enable Prism Analytics on your tenant? Obviously based on your purchase agreement and your subscription agreement. So the first step is to basically have that agreement with Workday. Now, many people think that Prism is a separate tenant. Prism can be enabled in any tenant for yourself. So you have your normal Workday tenant wherein you're handling your HCM or compensation, your reporting. In that very tenant, you can go ahead and enable Prism Analytics. So the first thing, we don't need a separate tenant for setting up Prism Analytics. All right. Okay. However, this needs to be enabled. So Workday will enable Prism Analytics in the defined tenant, right? And this depends on your agreement. The second thing, once the tenant is enabled for Prism Analytics, then you have to activate it for yourself, right? So for example, my tenant is enabled for HCM and compensation and payroll, but then I then have to activate those modules or set up those modules. And what is the first step for setting up any module in Workday, not just Prism, is to enable the functional area. So what Workday has done is it has divided its entire solution, all the solutions that are available, into different functional areas. So Workday, it has divided its entire solution or solutions into different functional areas. Now there's actually a report which is simply called functional areas. If you go to this report, it will show you all the functional areas and the ones which are enabled or active for you. So if you go here, if you see there is HCM, there's this functional area called academic faculty, which is enabled or active for you. Similarly, if I search for Prism, so Prism Analytics as a functional area should be activated. So this is that functional area. Once activated, will give you the ability to set up the relevant security and will give you access to all the internal domains within that functional area. So domains, your entire functionality is encapsulated within different domains, which are part of any given functional area. So the second task is to activate or enable the Prism Analytics functional area. Activating a functional area is not really a security job, right? Activating the relevant domains within that functional area is a security job. So this is something the functional team or you as a Prism Analytics member would do. Okay, and one thing to remember when it comes to Prism, there wouldn't be usually a separate security team which will do that. You would be responsible for managing the appropriate security as well. Okay, and so that is why it is you need to understand the associated security setup as well. Okay, now how do I activate any functional area? There is this task. Now our functional area is already enabled, so we'll not be able to enable it once again. So there is this task called maintain functional areas, right? We'll simply go in here and enable the respective functional area, right? So the task is maintain functional areas. Okay, and then finally you set up relevant security groups and permissions, right? So finally we set up a relevant security groups and the associated permissions. So you set up the relevant security groups and the associated permissions. One thing to remember for setting up your security groups is that for all your domains we can only define two types of security groups. One is unconstrained and then a role-based constraint. So these are the only two security groups which are allowed to be assigned on any of your Prism related domains. If I can quickly, I will talk about security later, but for now, if I come to Prism, right, and these are the different domains. Let me go to one of these. Right, if you see the only security groups that are allowed are unconstrained and your constrained security groups. Prism access are your constrained security group. You cannot go ahead and create, for example, a job-based security group or or any other security, an integration security group, and so on and so forth, and assign it to your Prism domains. Okay, one more thing. I'm just thinking whether I should talk about this. Okay, fine, no problem. We'll look at that later. So these are the three very simple steps that we need to define for enabling Prism Analytics in Workday. Okay, now let's look at the Prism Analytics data management workflow. So this entire course that we'll cover will actually be talking about these 5 steps which are part of this workflow. So once and these are very simple logical steps. Once we understand them, we'll be able to remember the entire Prism setup. It's very simple to go ahead and define Prism Analytics. Okay, so the first step of Prism Analytics is to create two different objects. What are those? First is to create tables and data sets. Data sets which are of type base. So the first thing is I have Prism environment. Now one thing to understand, that Prism environment is logically separate from from Workday. In the sense, as I mentioned, your Prism Analytics is in the same tenant as your normal Workday usage, right? So in this very tenant, I have my employee data, I have the compensation data, I have the payroll data, and so on and so forth. I also have Prism Analytics. Now, Prism Analytics cannot go ahead and directly access the employee data. It cannot go ahead and directly access the payroll data. So all of this data, even if it is within Workday, has to be brought into this logical environment called Prism Analytics. So the first step is to get data into Prism environment. That data can be coming from Workday or from outside Workday. And how do you get that data? By creating tables and base data sets. So the first thing is to create tables and base data sets to bring in data. Bring in data into your Prism environment. And this Prism environment is referred to as data catalog. We'll look at this data catalog in detail. So the first step of Prism data management workflow is to create tables or is to bring data into your Prism environment. And you do that by creating tables and base data sets. Right? Now, in the context of ETL workflow, ETL is a generic term which is used in uh, many business intelligence tools or BI tools, right? And in that, we use the term called ETL, extract, transform, and load, right? So in ETL context, this is the data extraction step or the extract part of the ETL workflow, because this is where I'm extracting data from different sources, Workday, non-Workday, right? So bring data into Workdays or Prism Analytics data catalog, right? And this data could be Workday data or external data, right? So that is my step number one. Okay, then we have the step number two. Once we have brought this data, right, the next step is to prepare that data. And how do I prepare this data? I do that by creating again data sets, but these are derived data sets. So there are two different data sets. One is base data sets, and then we have derived data sets. So create derived data sets to transform the data. Now, what are these derived data sets? Why and how we create them? We'll look at this later, right? And how do we transform this data? By applying. So data is transformed in pipelines using different stages. So two objects to remember. One is a pipeline, and we'll talk about pipelines, and stages. What are these different stages? I can join my data, I can union my data, I can do Prism calculations, I can manage fields. So data is transformed by joining them, by blending them, by adding different modifications, calculations, and so on and so forth. So this corresponds to, so in ETL workflow, this corresponds to the data transformation step. The third thing, once you have transformed this data, the next aspect is to apply security to the data. Okay, now with respect to security, Prism Analytics follow the same security model as a report security does. Okay, so the idea is when you first create a data set, which is basically when you bring in data, right? Workday automatically or implicitly applies security to the data in the data set. And this security is applied through a domain which is called Prism default to dataset access. Now, what is this domain? I'll talk about this later. So the idea is even if you don't apply any security, Workday implicitly applies a default domain security through a domain which is called default to dataset access, right? However, especially in your production environment, you would override this by specifying your explicit security domains. So the idea is you can edit the security or this implicit security by editing the data source security. So as you mentioned, all security is applicable on the data source, on the data set. So what is this data source security? How it works on Prism data? Again, we'll talk about this in detail when we talk about the security aspects of. Okay, finally, once your security is applied, then the idea is you make the data available for analysis, and you do that by creating a third type of data set, or you actually don't create this third type of data set, you define this data set which is called published data sets. So you make the data for available for analysis by publishing your data sets, and when you publish your data sets, it creates a published data sets. So there are different objects that we'll talk about. We'll talk about base data sets, we'll talk about derived data sets, we'll talk about published data sets, we'll talk about pipelines, we'll talk about stages, and we'll look at different types of transformations. All right. So when data set is published, right? Data in the data set. So when you publish a data set is nothing but a collection of data, which is collection of rows and columns. So data set is nothing but a collection of data. So when you publish this data set, the data which is part of this data set, it becomes available for analysis. So data in the data set is made available for analysis. And how is it made available? By creating a data source. So this happens by creating a Prism data source. So just like when we create a normal report, we use a data source, which is Workday delivered data source. We can use all active and terminated workers. We use all workers. We use workers for HCM reporting. We use assign adjustment force. So there are different types of data sources which are available. And these are all Workday delivered data sources. In exactly the same manner, when you publish a data set, Workday creates a data source, and that is the Prism data source. On this data source, then Workday applies the data source security that you defined earlier, which is what controls who would have access to the data source. Now, how is this controlled? Using your step number 5. So once you have your data source created, you can then build reports on that data source. So finally, after a Prism data source is created or is available, you can use it to create reports and visualizations. So finally, how do you analyze any data? You analyze it by building reports, right? So once Workday has created your Prism data source, it acts exactly like a Workday delivered data source, which means you can now create advanced reports, you can create matrix reports, you can create composite reports, you can create discovery boards on this data source and use it for your analysis and your reporting. So as we go through this entire course, this is all that we'll be looking at. We'll be talking about these 5 steps to understand what Prism Analytics is. So the next thing that we'll talk about, so having discussed all of these basics, let's go into the tenant and look at this environment. So the first thing that we'll talk about is the environment itself. As I mentioned, Workday's Prism environment is logically separate from the entire Workday tenant, and that environment is called the data catalog. Okay, so let me log in. Okay, so how do I access the Prism environment? Using this report called data catalog or data catalog. So this is my Prism environment. This environment consists of 2 different objects, tables and data sets. So we'll talk about tables and data sets in detail. But before that, let's look at the environment itself and let's see what all details can I access through this environment, right? So data catalog refers to the logical Prism environment within a tenant. Okay, now this is divided into different sections. This one is called the data catalog details panel. So one on the left hand side, this is referred to as the data catalog details panel. Now this would give me access to all of my data, which is divided into object type view. So what is this object type view? I can view different tables, or I can view, let me remove the filter. So I can view either all data, which consists of tables as well as data sets. I can view tables, or I can view data sets. So this is referred to as the object type view. Okay, so the first thing that I have is data catalog details panel, right? Then we have the object type view, right? Wherein based on your permissions, so if you only have access to create tables, you'll only see tables. If you only have access to create data sets, you'll only see data sets. So based on your permissions, you can view. So permissions allows you to view tables, data sets, or all data. Okay, the next option is to create your different objects. Now, obviously, you can see data which is part of these different objects which are already created, and we'll see how the data looks. But before that, if you want to create any new object, you can click on this create button. So this is what allows you to create your different objects to bring in your data. Now here you'll see two types of objects. One is base data sets and derived data sets and tables. So if I go in here, you can create, if you see base data sets, you can create derived data sets and you can create tables. So this is what allows you to bring and transform your data as part of your Prism Analytics setup. Okay, so these are your data import options. The next one is your data import options, and these are base or derived data sets and tables. Okay, the next one is your tag filter. Now the problem with this is, if you see when I click here, how many data sets are there? There are, I think, at least 30-40 different data sets, and these were created as part of different project requirements. So some of these, if you see, were created just now. Some of these could have been created back in 2018, 19, and so on and so forth. So you may want to transform different types of data for different Prism requirements. Now the problem is, it becomes very difficult to manage your data, right? So the Workday best practice is you define tags for your data or your data sets and your tables. The advantage is you can click on these tags and filter on your tags. So I am filtering, let's say, on Prism, and it shows me all the objects which were created for Prism. So unlike your studio wherein you have the ability to link multiple integrations to through an assembly project, here you don't have the ability. So in order to manage your data, it is recommended, it's a best practice that you define these tags, right? Now there's two way, either, let me remove this. Okay, there are two ways. So when I click on any data, whenever I click on any object, and let me click here. The moment I do that, system opens up this panel for me, and this panel is known as an inspector panel, right? And this panel shows me details on that object that I'm clicking. So it shows me that this data set, it was last modified on this date. There's no description that has been defined. No security has been applied on this data source till now. This data set is bringing in data through external files. I will talk about this later. The status of this data set is not published. We'll look at this in a bit, and this is the associated tag, and these are the all the fields which are part of this data set. Now I want to filter, see other data sets which have the same tag or which are part of the same project. I can simply click here, and then it automatically adds that filter for me, right? So highly recommended that whenever you create any objects, you add a tag to it. And the second thing is you give relevant names for your data sets. Having a relevant naming convention and adding proper tags is important. Else, by the time you have 100 data sets, you'll find it is extremely difficult for you to manage and know what was created for what purpose. Okay, so we'll talk about create options and this activities and everything. What is inspector panel? What is source type? What is this imported by? We'll look at all of them in detail. Okay, and the fourth option is your tag filter. And then we looked at inspector panel, right? So inspector panel, it shows the the details of the object. So what are details that does an inspector panel show? It shows the tags associated with that object. It shows the fields in that object, right? Which is what columns are in that object. It shows the security associated with that object, right? It shows the data source, and it shows something called imported by option. I will talk about this imported by option in a bit. So when I click here, it shows me this imported by option. Similarly, when I click here and click on this once again, it shows this imported by option. So what is this imported by option? We'll talk about this when I talk about lineage. So for now, it just tells me that the data in this data set is imported by data in this data set, which means employee headcount pension, which is a BDS. So this data set, which is BDS employee headcount pension, the data in this data set is imported by data in this data set, right? Or I can put it this way, this is the upstream system and this is the downstream system. How can I check that? If I go in here, we'll talk about lineage later. For now, if I go in here, I click on view lineage. You'll see this DDS, it is imported, it is importing this BDS. So that's why when I click on this BDS, it showed me that this BDS was imported by this data set. Now, what is this diagram? What does it mean? I'll show that. Again, when I click here, this data set, if you see, is imported by this data set, which is this data set here. So headcount union. So this data set is imported by this data set. This data set, if I click here, is imported by two data sets. One is this one and the second one is this one, and that's why I see two imported by options, right? So this is the downstream system which imports data from this upstream system. Similarly, this is the downstream system which imports data from this import system, upstream system. These two are downstream systems which import data from this upstream system. Similarly, this is the downstream system which imports data from this as well as this upstream system. All right, so this is referred to as a data set lineage. So if you have asked that, let me show you another. Uh, let's take this one. Now we'll use this as an example for our structure as well. Let me. So when I click on any data set or table and right click it, it shows me a lineage, right? So what is a lineage? Lineage basically shows me the interrelationship between different objects. So if you see, in this case, these three are my BDS or base data sets. So can I only have one base data set? Not really. I can have any number of base data sets. So this is the lineage diagram of this data set. So it basically shows me how this data set is importing data right from the very source. So if you see this data set, right, it is not import. It is imported by this data set, which is this one, right? So what is a lineage? A lineage shows the interrelationship between different data sets and different tables. So this is simply a visual representation of how I'm importing data from one object to another object. Okay, so as part of this, let's talk about the table and data set lineage. So when is this lineage created? As you create your different data sets and you import data into those data sets, Workday, based on the relationship that you have defined, automatically creates this lineage diagram, right? So lineage allows you to view the dependencies between different tables and data sets, right? A lineage, it shows two types of dependencies. The first one is your downstream dependency. Okay, now I already mentioned what is upstream and what is downstream. So for this data set, this is upstream because this data set is importing data from here. So water always flows from upstream to downstream. Similarly, data flows from upstream data set to a downstream data set. So for this data set, this one, right? Let me highlight, right? So for this data set, this one is the upstream, whereas this data exports data into it. So this one is the downstream. Now, one thing to remember that a base data set, it only has downstream dependencies because a base data set only exports data. A base data set or a table, it never imports data.
Yep.
So let me uh, okay, so downstream dependencies, all base data sets and tables can only have downstream dependencies. And if you go back to our first flow diagram, you'll understand that because your base data sets and tables, they are the starting point. So they are the one which are bringing in data into Prism. Once the data has been brought into Prism using base data sets and tables, from there it could be imported by many other derived data sets, which means your base data sets is the starting point of your Prism workflow. So your base data sets and tables only have downstream dependencies. Okay, whereas derived data sets, they may have upstream, they will in fact always will have upstream and or, right? So your derived data sets, if you look at this derived data set once again, it only has upstream dependency. It doesn't have any downstream. Whereas this derived data set has both upstream as well as downstream. So your derived data sets may have both upstream as well as it may also have the downstream dependencies. So this interrelationship between different data sets in terms of upstream and downstream dependencies is what defines a lineage diagram, right? And this is what controls the imported by option. So it defines the derived data set which imports data from a given data set, which is it only shows the downstream dependency. So A data set is imported by B, which means for A, B is the downstream data set. Okay. All right. Finally, on your data catalog, we have, so this is the fifth option. Under data catalog, we have inspector panel, we have tag filter, and then table and dataset lineage I can view from the inspector panel. Finally, I can also see Prism data usage. Now this is a very important metric because your commercial agreements, so anytime anywhere I am, if I want to go back to the data catalog, I can simply click here and it takes me back to the data catalog. Okay, the next one, how much Prism you're using, your agreement with Workday depends on that. What do I mean? Excuse me. How much Prism you're using? So when you subscribe to Workday Prism Analytics, right? Your commercial, excuse me, 1 second. So in your data catalog, you have this activities button. Let me open this activities button. Now this button, it actually defines your Prism data usage. Okay, let me click on activities once again. Okay, now this shows you the Prism data usage. Now this is what controls your commercial agreement with Workday. Now this basically shows the number of rows of data that you have published. So if you see, as part of this tenant, we have published 1.1 million rows of data. So when you have your commercial agreement with Workday, it depends on, they would say, okay, we for X number of million or billion rows, this is the commercials. And if you go beyond that, then it is extra charge, or your commercials will have to be renegotiated. So you have to be extremely careful with how you're designing your Prism, because ultimately the more the number of rows of data you publish over a period of time, you'll find that your usage has exceeded your commercial agreement. So there are two metrics it shows. One is the number of rows of data that have been published, and the second one is how much amount of disk space on Workday that is using. So it is using some 500 MBs of disk space for 1.1 million rows. Now this is the overall metrics for your entire tenant usage. You may or may not have access to all of these data sources depending on your security. So this shows the overall metrics. And then here down, it shows you those data sets that you have access to. So if you see this data source, it only has two published rows, and there are 6.8 KB of data, right? This data set has some 444 rows, and the disk usage it shows as 0 bytes, and so on and so forth. So these are the actual data sets that you have access to, and it shows the Prism usage against those data sets. But then this is the overall metrics. You may not have access to everything, right? So it shows us two metrics. So activities tab on the data catalog. This is what shows you the Prism data usage. The first one is the total disk space used, right? And it summarizes the disk space used for all data source, for all data sources, or all data in Prism, tables and data sets. This is including the tables and data sets that you may not have access to. So it shows the overall metrics. Similarly, the second one is total rows published, which is the same concept. So it summarizes the it summarizes the rows of data in all published Prism tables and data sets, even if you don't have access to. Whereas this table, it only displays those tables and data sets that you have access to, right? And then it shows me the publishing activities. So what publishing happened, when it happened, was it a success, what is a failure, and then I can go to the details and see those details as well. We'll talk about publishing in detail later. Okay, so that is an important metrics showing you your Prism data usage or your Prism usage. So now let's look at the data sets itself. So we have spoken about the data catalog. Now we'll look at data sets, and we'll look at how we define our data sets. As I already mentioned, there are three types of data sets that we can create. The first one is a base data set, then we have derived data sets, and finally we have the published data sets. So what is a data set, right? Okay, so if I have to define a data set is a Prism analytics object. So it is an object in your Prism analytics setup. Okay, and what does this object do? It basically controls some underlying data and describes the processing logic to transform or manipulate this data. So a prism or a data set is an object that shows you or that controls some underlying data and describes the processing logic to transform this data. So in essence, every data set has the ability to transform or manipulate data. And it basically shows you that transformation logic. And that transformation logic is defined in terms of pipelines and stages. I'll talk about that later. So for now, the only thing we need to understand that a data set shows you the processing logic as to how it transforms the data that is included in it or that it holds. The second aspect, it also shows some underlying data. Why do I say some? Because a data set as such may have millions and billions of records. But when you view a data set, you can never view all of those records. You can only see a section of those records up to a maximum of 20,000. So you can only see a sample data which is included in the data set, but it will show you all the processing logic that it uses to manipulate that data, right? So a data set, if I have to define it, is also referred to as metadata. So what is metadata? Metadata is nothing but data about the data. So it basically defines the processing logic as to how it handles its data or manipulates its data. And this data could be Workday or non-Workday or a blend of both. So this could be a Workday data, non-Workday data, or you may have created a data set which brings all of that data together. Okay, now let's go into a data set and see what I actually mean by this. So you can see all of this data using data set workspace. So similar to how we saw the data catalog workspace, in exactly similar manner, we can see the data set workspace as well. And how can you access the data set workspace? By clicking on so I'll proxy as Logan because Logan has the extended authorizations. Okay, so for example, let me open some random data set. Let's open uh, this one, right? So what I can do is I can right click and view that data set or view the lineage. We have already seen this. I can edit it. Let me start with view in new tab. Okay, so here get to see the same set of details a bit more as to what we saw in the inspector panel. So here I basically get to see the same set of details. So I can see some description. I can see how that data was created, right? Or how that data set was created, when it was created, by whom it was created, the last modifications, any security that has been applied, the status, Prism data source, and when was it last successfully published. So we'll talk about these aspects later. Okay, for now, if I scroll down, it shows me all the rows of data or all the fields or columns. This is similar to how we have columns in a custom report. Okay, when I click on any one of these columns, it shows me again, it shows up the inspector panel and it shows the details of that column. So this field or this column is of type numeric. It has four numbers, two before decimal and two after decimal. And it also shows me some analytics about that column. So it shows me what is the midpoint, and this midpoint is based on the data which is in this column. So it shows that in this column there are three distinct values. One is some 0.32 or 1.2. This is the second one 2, and this is the some 4.1. And median or the midpoint of this is here. And then it shows me those values, right? And so on and so forth. Whenever I click on any column, it shows me the details of that column in this inspector panel. Okay, if you see, it also shows me a sample of that data. So this is what I mentioned. It will at the max show you some underlying data. So I can control this sample by selecting either 100 rows or 1k rows or a maximum of 20k rows. So if my data set has more than 20k rows, then I can see only a maximum of these number rows of data in the data set. Okay, now when I click here, that is when it show me the data. Now this data set only has 3 rows of data. And if you see, when I was clicking here, it was showing me those distribution. So 0.32 is one of the value which is in 33% of the records, right? Obviously out of 3. So it shows you these analytics as well. And then based on these 3 values, it is showing me the median and the number of distinct values. Similarly, when I click here, if you see, there are only two distinct values, because one is 1 and then 95, and it shows me the median, right? And these metrics are automatically shown. You don't have to do that. Okay, now when I click on edit, either here or if I directly click on edit here, it will take me to the data set workspace. So when I click on edit here, this is where I can actually go to the data set workspace. Now, as I mentioned earlier, a data set defines the processing logic. And this processing logic is encapsulated in terms of pipelines and stages. Now we'll talk about this processing logic in detail later. We'll see what is a pipeline, what is a stage later as we create our data set. For now, if I go to this data set workspace by clicking on edit, this is where it shows me the pipeline, and within the pipeline it shows me the stages. So my data manipulation happens through this pipeline and through these stages. right? And this is referred to as my pipeline list. So this separates this section on the left hand side. This is my pipeline details panel, and it shows me my pipeline list. What is my pipeline list? So here I have my primary pipeline. For now, don't worry about what is a primary pipeline. So this is my primary pipeline. If I click here, it shows me all the additional pipelines as well. Plus I can add any extra pipeline if I want to. So if I click here, this is my second pipeline, and it only has 2 stages. However, if I go to this pipeline, which is my primary pipeline, it has a number of stages. So the left hand side is my pipeline details panel. It shows me a list of all the pipelines which are part of that data set. And for each of those pipelines, it shows me all the stages which are part of that pipeline. Okay. The next thing, it shows me, as I mentioned, a sample data. Now I can select any other sample, right? It refreshes. If there are more than 20k rows, here there are only 16 rows, right? That is fine. But sub data set, if they, and obviously your data set in production, they may have hundreds and thousands and millions of rows. So you can see a maximum of 20k rows, right? Okay, if you want, you can go back to your data catalog by clicking on here. Now for each stage, it shows me the stage statistics. So right now I'm on this stage by default. This is my stage number 8. If I click here, this is stage number 2. This is the stage type, and it shows me the stage statistics. This stage has a total of 9 fields, including 0 calculated fields. If I click here, this stage only has 6 fields, and there are no calculated fields. Let's click here. This stage has 5 fields. So when I click on any stage, this shows me the stage statistics, as well as the data that I see here is relevant for that stage. So here, if you see, when I click on manage stage, how many rows of data is there? I have 41 or 42 rows of data, right? Let's click on here. There is only 16 rows of data, and the columns as well, if you see, have changed. If I click here, again I have 41 or 42 rows of data, and these are all the columns. So when I click on any stage within my pipeline details panel, my details data section or my example data section automatically refreshes, and it shows me details relevant to that stage, right? So this section is known as my example data section because it simply shows me the example data. If there are number of fields, now here there are just 15 or 5 or 6 fields, but you'll come across data sets which may have 100 plus fields. You can quickly click here, and you can select fields from here, right? Instead of you having to scroll through this and see which field is where, you can directly click here. It will show you all the fields. So for example, if I click here, there are 9 fields, and all of these show here, and I can quickly select that field, right? Okay, if I want to add any new field, a new calculated field, right now if you see there are 0 calculated field. I want to add a new calculated field. I'll click here, right? Now there is one calculated field, and I can define the calculation that for that field. Once I've done everything, because I've made some changes, it now enables the save button for me, and I can go ahead and save the changes that I've done. So now overall there are 10 fields, out of which one is a calculated field. I've not defined any calculation for now. We can go ahead and define calculations. For now, we'll not do that. I want to add a new field. I can add a new field. Now there are total 11 fields, 2 of which are calculated fields. All right, let's go back to the data catalog. Any point in time, you can go back to your data catalog from here. Okay, the second thing before I do that, when I click on any field, again, similar to how we clicked on a data set and it would show up the inspector panel. And similarly, when I view the data set as well, when I click on any field, it would show the inspector panel for that field within the data set. Exactly similar to that. So when I click on any field here again, it would show up the inspector panel. In exactly same manner, when I click on any field, it shows the inspector panel for that field. Now that inspector panel has two sections. For any standard field, it only shows one section, which is field type. So if I click any of these standard fields, let me, right? So if I click here, this is a field of type date, and then it shows me the values. Right? This is the only data that it shows me. However, when I click on any calculated field, it shows me two sections. One is field details and the functions library. So now for these calculated fields, we have not selected any functions, but this is similar to how we create our calculated fields for using calculated field functions. So here it shows me all the functions which are available. I can go through these set functions, select them by clicking on plus icon, or I can simply search for them. So let's say again hours, right? And it shows me all the matching, right? And then I can click on this plus icon and it automatically adds that function to this field. If I want to view the details, I can click on this arrow and it shows me a short description of what that function is, what is the syntax for that function, what is the data type which is returned, and then it also shows me a small example for each of the functions. So for calculated fields, your function shows or your inspector panel shows both field info as well as the functions library. For a normal field, it only shows the field info. Let's go back to the data catalog. It is asking me if I want to save those changes or discard them. I'm saying simply discard them. So this is the data set workspace, right? So click on edit to go to the data set workspace, right? What all options are available in the dataset workspace? The first one is the pipeline list, which is the left hand side column, and it shows the list of pipelines which are imported into that data set. The second one is it also shows the pipeline. When I click on any pipeline, it shows me the pipeline details, which basically shows all stages within that pipeline, right? When I click on any stage, it shows me the example data table. So whenever I click on any stage, for that stage based on the data in that stage, it shows me the example data. Okay, then if I click on any field, it shows up the inspector panel, which consists of two things. One is field info and the functions library. So functions library, it is only shown for calculated fields, right? So field info shows me the top n values, the field type, etc. So it shows me what is the type of field, whether it is a date type field, it shows me the field statistics, and then the top n values and so on and so forth, right? Okay, inspector panel, sorry. And then finally, I can add Prism calculated field expression bar. So this is my Prism calculator. The one which showed me on the left hand side, that was my Prism calculated field expression bar. When we create our Prism calculated fields, that's when we'll look at that is expression bar. Okay, so there are a lot of other things to discuss. However, I'll discuss them as we create our data sets. So as we create our data sets, that's when we'll talk about the different field types that your data set support, the field mappings that happens, the concept of null values, and a lot of other things, and also all the different stages. For now, we'll talk about creating your data sets. So if I can again, let me take any one. So if I click on edit, I don't have, okay, this someone has not defined any schema. Let me click on edit. So when you add any field, this is your calculated field expression bar. So let's say I want to select a function, and this is the function I want to select. Let's say days between. This is my expression bar. Right? Okay. So till now, we have looked at our data sets, our data catalog, right? We have looked at what is the overview or what are the different moving parts of a data catalog. Within a data catalog, we have looked at the data sets, or how or what are the different aspects of a data set. The next part is how do we create a data set, right? Okay, now how do we create a data set really depends on what activity or what do I want to achieve with that data set. So is this data set only being created to read data or get data into Prism environment, or is this data set being created to transform and modify the data? So the purpose of the data set actually defines or identifies how the data set will be created. Okay, and within that purpose, the way you want to get that data again defines the various subtypes for creating your data set. Okay, so let's start with creating our first data sets, which is our base data sets. Now we saw earlier that there are three types of data sets. One is base data set, then we have derived data set, and then we have a third category as well, which is when the data set gets published, it becomes the published data set. Now the question is, why would I create a base data set? So how would I create it? There are different ways, through custom reports, through file, through SFTP, and so on and so forth. But the question is, why would I create it? Okay, so if you remember when we spoke about the lineage, here we have. We looked at the lineage, we mentioned that Base data sets, they only have downstream dependencies. And why is that the base data sets only have downstream dependencies? So your base data sets act as the starting point. Now, what do we mean by acting as a starting point? Your starting point for any data transformation is getting data. So your base data sets and tables as well, we'll talk about tables, very similar concept with some minor variations. So we'll look at tables in the end. Okay, so the idea is you would create your base data set to basically get data into Workday. So create tables and base data sets to bring in data into your Workday Prism environment, which is data catalog. And that is why they only have downstream dependencies. Okay, so a base data set is created to extract or bring in data from Workday or external sources into the Prism environment. So base data set is created to extract data from Workday environment or non-Workday environment into the Prism environment, right? Okay, so while creating a base data set, you can only use one type of source, right? So how to extract data depends on the source type. So you can only use one source type, but then within that source type, you can use multiple source files. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. So for now, remember, a base data set can only be based on or created using one source type. And what are those different source types? The first one is from a custom report. So if I have created a base data set which extracts data from a custom report, I cannot go ahead and change it and change the source type to something else. So your source type can only be single. But then you can have multiple source files, which means you can run your custom report multiple times and load data multiple times into this base data set. Similarly, if you are creating a base data set which is extracting data from a file, it cannot go ahead and you cannot go ahead and change it later to extract data, let's say from a SFTP server. But then you can upload multiple files of that type. So there can only be one source type, but of that type, you can load any number of files. Similarly, you can load multiple files from your local machine and so on and so forth. So what are the three different source types, or what are the three different methods for creating a base data set? You can create a base data set from a custom report. And obviously, when you say a custom report, it means you are loading Workday data. The next option is from a file. This is used for external data. And similarly, from an SFTP server, this is again used for loading data through an external data. So there can only be one source type for a given base data set, but then there can be multiple source files. So a base data set is based on one or more source files. Okay, so now before I create my base data set, let me show you what I'm trying to do. So here we have a single example that will build throughout this class. So in this example, I am taking data from different sources. So the first is I would import data from Workday, and then I would also import external data. Okay, now this data that I'm importing from Workday, I would obviously do that through custom reports. And I'll not be using a single custom report. I'll be using three different custom reports. So which means from Workday, I'll be importing three different sources of data. And then from external file, I would upload data. And then I will bring all of this data together and transform and modify and build my ultimate output, which can be then be used for my analytics. Okay, we cannot use an SFTP server. I'll show you how an SFTP server is used, right? It is very similar, exactly similar to a file, but obviously because we don't have an SFTP connection, we'll not be able to establish a connection with an SFTP server, right? But we'll also see how an SFTP data set is created. Okay. All right. Now, what are the three different datas that I'm reading? So for now, or to begin with, I have created three custom reports. Okay. So what are those custom reports that I have created? I have created three custom reports. One is ZF01. Okay. So I've created three custom reports. One is ZF01, ZF02, and ZF03. Let me go ahead and open each one of these custom reports. So understanding what data I'm loading, it's an important part of your Prism Analytics configuration, because until you understand what is the data and what is the different logical connections between your data, between different data sources, you'll not be able to work on that data. Okay, so these are the three different custom reports that I have built. They're very simple. Okay, the first report is the company structure. Turn on. Let's click here, right? So it shows those alternate columns now. Next thing, let's click on collapsible rows. Okay, so it is showing me, if you see the difference. Okay, this is good, right? Because now we can see the difference between separate columns, separate rows. Okay, any which ways. So this is where we were, right? Uh, so my first report, it is basically importing company data. Now, if I go ahead and look at this report structure, it's a very simple report. I think I have built it on organizations or company. Yeah, I built it on this data source, which is company hierarchy. And this is all I'm doing. I'm checking the name of the company, right? I'm checking the name of the Workday ID for that company, and then I'm getting the subtype of that company, which I'm calling a sector, right? And for each of those companies or company hierarchies, I'm checking what is their parent company and the Workday ID of the parent company. Okay, all right. So if you see, for each of these custom organizations, I'm checking, or each of these company hierarchies, I'm checking what is the superior organization and the Workday ID of the superior organization. So if I run this report now, okay, so this is my output. So it shows me that there are 7 or 8 companies. This is the associated Workday ID. So for North America, the parent company is company hierarchy, which is over here. And company hierarchies looks like it doesn't have any parent company, so it is the top level company. Similarly for EMEA, the superior company is company hierarchy. For Asia Pacific, it is again company hierarchy. So at the top, I have company hierarchy under which I have these 4 companies. Under EMEA, then I have Europe. And under EMEA, I also have Middle East and Africa. Okay. Now, what is this subtype? Every object, I'm sure you are aware, every organization that we create in Workday, we associate a subtype for that organization. So for example, if I go ahead and open this company hierarchy or company which is North America, it is associated with a subtype, which I'm calling as mobility. Okay, so here I've simply designed a structure saying this company of mine is a mobility. So for example, if I take Reliance, Reliance has different companies. So Reliance Jio and maybe a few other companies which are part of their telecommunication, right? Or if I take Tata, now Tata has Tata Motors, Tata Commercial Vehicles, and so on and so forth, which are all part of their mobility sector, right? And then it has TCS and maybe a few other companies which are all part of their IT, and so on and so forth. So what I've done is I've simply, now here the name doesn't make sense because this was obviously a GMS tenant, a test tenant. I've just created some sample data. Okay. So here the name actually could be Tata Motors, right? And here it could be Tata Electricity or Tata Electricals, or this could be anything. So here it's just that we have named as EMEA, Asia Pacific, and so on and so forth. Okay. The next report is the supervisory structure. Now in this report, I'm basically pulling all the supervisory organizations in global modern services effective as of today's date. Now when I run this report, it shows me all the supervisory orgs and their respective headcount. So if you see, this is the supervisory of global modern services. Their the current year headcount, which is fiscal year's headcount, is 584. Physical year minus 1, which is last fiscal year's headcount, was 494.5, and before that it was this. For each supervisory org, it is showing me the headcount trend over the last 3 years, right? And these were simply standard fields that I have pulled. Okay, for each organization, it shows me the type of that organization. Now, obviously, these are all supervisory organization types. Again, it shows me the Workday ID for that organization. And then it shows me the organization level from the top. So GMS is my top level organization, which is level 1. Under GMS, I have executive management group. And if you see, there are 4 other organizations which are all at level 2, right? And then I have human resources and so on and so forth, which are all at level 3. So for each of these organizations, I have also shown at what level from the top they exist. Okay, then for each of these organizations, I am also pulling, similar to how I was pulling the subtype for each of these companies. I'm also pulling the subtypes for each of these supervisory orgs. Okay, all right. Now if you see, for these organizations at level 3, so if I open human resources, again, don't worry, how is human resources related to energy? This is just a sample data. If I go to human resources, if you see, the subtype is energy. which is what is displayed here. Now, the problem is if I scroll down, this is the actual subtype associated to a given organization. So risk management, which is actually, if I go ahead and open risk management. So here I have risk management. If I go to details, risk management subtype is division. So here I'm simply showing the subtype of any given organization under this column, right? But then risk management, this is part of, if I come here, risk management, this is part of finance and administration. And what is the subtype of finance and administration? It is life sciences. So if I scroll up, finance and administration, it is life sciences. So any organization which is below level 3, I'm forced to find the actual subtype of that organization, but also the subtype of the level 3 organization they belong to. And that is why you see two subtype fields. Make sense? Why is this the case? Why is that I have pulled the actual subtype of organizations below level 3 as well as their third level subtype? That is something we'll look at Prism Analytics. All right, so this is my second level, second custom report. Now, how is my this custom report related to the first custom report? So whenever we are dealing with data from different sources and we need to transform and blend that data in Prism, there should be some common link between different data. So here I know, for example, EMEA, or let's say, yeah, EMEA, which is energy. And now I know that human resources is also energy. So this is how I know that this organization is part of this company, which is energy. So the link that I have defined between my different data points in this case is the sector of a company matches to the subtype of my supervisory. So whenever you're dealing with data from different sources, you should have something in common. If you don't have anything in common between two data points, so one is my customer data, second is my employee data. If there is no way I can link that data together, how am I going to bring them together? The third is now my employee details. Now here again, I'm pulling data for all the employees in GMS. And how is that I'm linking this data to other data? Through the supervisory org. So here the link is, so under human resources, if you see these are the employees under human resources and so on and so forth. So here the link is the supervisory org of the worker can be linked to the supervisory org here. Okay, or the name here or the ID here. So this is, so my, what is that I'm ultimately trying to achieve? What I want is for each of these companies, I want to understand all the organizations and the associated workers. And for each of these workers, I want to understand their headcount trend, their termination trend, their hire details, and I want to do reporting in all aspects on a given company. Okay, now in addition to this, so this is all of my data which is part of my Workday system itself. In addition to this, I would also be pulling some data from my from outside Workday, and that data I'm pulling is in the form of a file. So in Workday, you cannot manage any stocks for your employees. Stocks have to be managed outside Workday because Workday doesn't give you the functionality to manage employee stocks. So from outside Workday, I'm pulling the details of all the employees and what have been the stocks that have been granted to them, what are the stocks which are due to be granted, and what is the vesting schedule. So I'll talk about this data in detail when I actually import this data. For now, it is difficult to understand this data. This is simply a comma separated file. So this is my external data that I'll bring, and then I'll transform and modify all of this data together. Okay, So the first thing that I'll do is I'll create my base data set from a custom report. Just give me a second. Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is create my base data set from custom report. Okay, now which report do you think can be used for creating a data set? Which report type? So Workday report that can be used for creating your base data set, obviously, as you said, has to be an advanced report. And then there are a few other prerequisite. Okay, so Workday report used as a data source. It must be an advanced report, right? So data sets at this point in time do not support any other report types for importing data. So you cannot import a matrix or a trending or a transposed or a composite or any other report type. Okay, so the first prerequisite is the report should be an advanced report. Now, anywhere you want to use a report as your data source, it could be an integration or any other reference, your report should be converted into an RAAS. Okay, so if I go to this report, so the second thing is your report should be enabled as a web service. So even when you use your reports as your data sources for EIBs or Studio, they should all be enabled as web services. You have not enabled your report as a web service. Even if you have enabled it for Prism, it wouldn't work. So your report should be an RAS enabled report, which is being enabled as a web service. Now, if I go back to this report, you see that web service XML alias, right? So the moment you enable any report as a web service, uh, what Workday would do is it would automatically add this. This is your column heading override value. This is your actual column heading, and you can override it using column heading override. So this is common as part of normal reporting. And then for that column heading override, Workday defines an XML alias. Now the thing about XML alias is that it has to be unique. You cannot have two. So if I come here, so if you see I have two columns with exactly the same name, but then their XML alias are different. So XML alias, I can go ahead and change it, but even if I change it, it has to be unique, right? So Workday automatically adds this XML alias. You can modify it as long as the XML alias is unique. This is strange. Okay, it has to be unique unless we'll see in web service how it works. So this XML alias has to be unique, and if you don't define it as unique, Workday wouldn't even allow you to save your changes. I don't know why it allowed me, but it doesn't allow you. The second thing, once you have defined your alias and you have used a you have created a base data set for this custom report, that base data set would refer to these XML aliases. So if you later go ahead and change these XML aliases, then you'll also have to change your base data sets. So give meaningful names before you save your base data, before you create your base data sets. If later on you go ahead and change it, then you'll also have to change your base data sets or your data sets as well. Okay, so system
Okay.
refers to these XML aliases. The same is the concept for your integrations as well. So if you have built-in integrations and later you change the XML alias, then your integration would fail. Okay, so be enabled as a web service. Next one, be enabled for Prism Analytics, right? Something you've already seen. And finally, uh, it should not include any fields from an RBO related business object that have a many to one relationship with primary business object. So you should not include any fields from a relative business object that has one to many relationship with the primary business object. Now, what do I mean by that? So for example, if I come here, if you see, a worker can have multiple additional jobs, right? So as such, I can add fields wherein I can add fields directly on my primary business object, which are multi-instance fields, and system would allow me to do that. But let me click on edit. Okay, so what I want to add is, let's say, addresses. Now a worker can have multiple addresses, right? So this is a multi-instance field, and if you see, I can add it. The system automatically adds an XML alias, and I can go ahead and save this. So if you see, I'm directly adding the multi-instance field from my primary business object. But let me do it the other way. So I want to add, let's say, addresses, and here again, will this work? Let's see. Now it gives me an error. The error says the report cannot be enabled for Prism because it includes a field from a related business object. So addresses here is a related business object that has got one to many relationship with the primary business object, which is worker, right? So at point in time, can I add a field from a related business object that has one to many relationship with the primary business object? Okay, so cannot include any fields from an RBO that have a many to one relationship with the primary business object. And finally, if your custom report includes a currency field, Now, if you have any currency field in your report, in that case, you must select the Show Currency column checkbox. So if I come here, again, if you see, I have a couple of currency related fields added. In which case, I should select this option which is Show Currency column. If I remove that, I get an error saying that this report is enabled for Prism and contains a currency field, but Show Currency column isn't selected. In Prism, whenever you are, unless you add the currency code, your Prism will not be able to identify, right, what is the relevant currency value. So Prism needs to differentiate between your normal numeric value and your currency value with the associated currency code. Okay, and we'll look at that later. So these are the 5 prerequisites for creating or for using a custom report into your data source. Okay, and as I mentioned, ensure that you don't change the column heading, override XML alias values in the custom report, definition, right, after data set is created. If you do that, your data set will fail or it wouldn't be able to identify the right column.